The auctioneer's voice, a gravelly bark honed by decades of selling off men's dreams and failures, crackled over the cheap loudspeaker. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this? This piece of history?" He gestured with a dismissive wave at the hulking machine squatting in the March mud. It was a Wagner TR-14, a relic from another time, its faded green paint blistered and peeling, revealing patches of deep, angry rust. Someone, likely as a joke, had taped a piece of cardboard to its massive grille. In crude black letters, it read, "Obsolete." A ripple of laughter went through the crowd of farmers huddled against the Iowa wind. They were here for the new stuff, the shiny red International Harvesters and the gleaming green John Deeres that promised efficiency and power, financed with banknotes that felt as light as feathers in these good times of '72. "Start the bidding at 500. Who'll give me 500 for the big green anchor?" the auctioneer cajoled. Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees bordering the auction yard. From the edge of the crowd, Richard Peterson let out a loud scoff. He was a man who wore his success like a brand new coat. His shoulders broadened by the easy confidence that came with a line of credit as long as a country mile. "Heck, Bill," he yelled to the auctioneer, "you'd have to pay me 500 just to haul that scrap heap off the lot." More laughter. Rich soaked it in, his gaze sweeping over his neighbors. He'd just bought another quarter section, and the rumor was he had a brand new John Deere 4620 on order, complete with a cab and air conditioning. He was the future of farming in Boone County, and everyone knew it. Tucked away at the back, leaning against the cold steel of a grain bin, Jedediah Stone said nothing. He wasn't looking at the rust or the faded paint. He was looking at the bones of the machine. The massive planetary axles, the thick, articulated frame. He could see the ghost of the power it once had, the sheer pulling force that had been engineered into its very soul. Most importantly, he recognized the shape of the valve covers on the engine block peeking through the grime. It was a Cummins, a big inline-six Cummins diesel. An engine built to run for 1,000,000 miles in a semi-truck, barely even breathing hard in a tractor. Jed had $3,427 to his name. It was cash, saved over 6 years of scrimping, of patching his own overalls and eating more beans than beef. It was the entirety of his worldly wealth, aside from the 160 acres his grandfather had left him, free and clear. His main tractor was a John Deere 4020, a good, honest machine, but it was getting tired. He needed more power if he was going to break up the hardpan on the North 40, but he'd sworn an oath on his grandfather's grave he'd never let a banker own a piece of his land or his equipment. "Come on, folks, it's got 4 wheels and they're all round. $200, the auctioneer pleaded, his voice laced with theatrical desperation. $250, a quiet, firm voice said from the back. Every head turned. Jed Stone, his jaw set, gave a slight nod to the auctioneer. A low murmur went through the crowd. What in the world was Jed thinking? Rich Peterson's face split into a condescending grin. He saw a chance for some sport. 300, he called out, not even looking at the tractor, but staring right at Jed, a challenge in his eyes. The auctioneer's rhythm picked up instantly. Got 300 from Mr. Peterson. Who'll say 3 1/4? Jed didn't flinch. 350. His voice was flat, betraying no emotion. 400. Rich shot back immediately. He was playing now, trying to make the poor fool pay for his stubbornness. 500, Jed said, his gaze locked on the Wagner. He had walked its perimeter 3 times before the auction started, tapping the frame with a ball-peen hammer he'd brought, listening for the ring of solid steel. He'd pulled the dipstick. The oil was black and thick, but there was no milky sheen of coolant, no telltale metallic glitter of a dying engine. A hush fell. $500 was real money for a joke. Rich Peterson hesitated. The fun was in making Jed sweat, not in actually getting stuck with the thing. He glanced at the Wagner, then back at Jed's determined face. He shrugged, a theatrical gesture of magnanimity. Let him have it. He needs the parts more than I do. Sold, the auctioneer's hammer cracked down. For $500 to Jedediah Stone. Son, you just bought yourself a whole lot of tractor. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low tones, shaking their heads. As Jed made his way to the payment trailer, Rich Peterson stepped into his path. "What in God's name are you going to do with that pile of junk stone?" Rich asked, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Use it as a boat anchor." Jed stopped and looked Rich square in the eye. He was shorter than Rich and leaner, but his hands were calloused and thick with the kind of strength that came from wrestling with iron day in and day out. "Gonna farm with it, Rich," he said, his voice low and even. "The same as you, just without the bank's signature on the title." He pushed past, leaving Rich standing there with a sour look on his face. Jed paid his $500 in cash, the clerk counting out the worn bills under a bare light bulb. He got a greasy bill of sale and the key, a simple tarnished piece of stamped metal that felt heavier than it should. An hour later, the auction yard was nearly empty. Jed stood before his purchase. Up close, it was even more intimidating. The tires were cracked with age but held air. The hydraulic lines were weeping fluid at nearly every connection. The cab was a steel cage with shattered glass and a seat that was nothing more than rusted springs and horsehair stuffing. He climbed the 3 steep steps into the cockpit and settled onto the ruined seat. The controls were a confusing array of heavy, grease-covered levers. He turned the key. Nothing. Not a click, not a groan. Just dead silence. Jed sighed, a plume of white breath in the cold air. He knew it wouldn't be that easy. He climbed down, popped the heavy hood panels, and laid a hand on the cold Cummins engine. It was all there. He could see it in his mind's eye, the pistons, the crank, the injectors. It was a mechanical puzzle, and there was nothing Jed Stone loved more than figuring out a puzzle made of steel. He knew he could bring it back to life. It would take work, it would take patience, it would take every ounce of his skill. Before we see if this old beast will even fire up, I've got to ask you all, what's the oldest piece of iron you still depend on? Whether it's a tractor, a truck, or an old lathe in the shop, I want to hear about it. Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. The first step was getting it home. Jed walked the 2 miles back to his farm and fired up the old 4020. He hitched up a heavy chain and drove back to the auction yard. Hooking the Wagner was a job in itself. The sheer dead weight of it made the 4020 grunt and spin its tires in the mud. He finally got it rolling, a 15-mile journey that took him the better part of 3 hours. The Wagner steered like a barge, its unpowered steering box fighting him every inch of the way. He passed neighbors who slowed their pickups to stare, some shaking their heads, others pointing and laughing. Jed kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the 4020's steering wheel. He felt their judgment like a physical weight, but it only hardened his resolve. He pulled the Wagner into his machine shed just as the sun was setting, the long shadow of the obsolete giant falling across the familiar, worn concrete floor. The shed was his sanctuary. It smelled of diesel, grease, and hot metal. Along one wall was his grandfather's workbench, a massive oak slab stained with the oils and secrets of 3 generations. Above it, tools hung in perfect order, wrenches, sockets, pullers, and gauges, each one clean and ready. This was where Jed was most comfortable, where the confusing world of bank loans and neighborhood gossip faded away, replaced by the simple, honest logic of machinery. For the next 2 weeks, the shed was lit at all hours. Jed didn't just want to get the Wagner running, he wanted to understand it, to know its every weakness and strength. He started with the electrical system, tearing out the old brittle wires that were cracked and frayed. He spent 2 days hunched over wiring diagrams he'd ordered from a surplus manual company, patiently running new heavy-gauge wire, soldering every connection, and sealing it with heat-shrink tubing. He installed new modern gauges for oil pressure and water temperature, flanking the old sun-faded tachometer. Next was the fuel system. He drained the tank, flushing out a gallon of rust-colored water and sludge. He pulled the fuel lines and blew them out with compressed air. The heart of the system was the Cummins PT fuel pump and the injectors. This was delicate work. He carefully removed each injector, a heavy, complex piece of machinery in itself. He disassembled them on his clean bench, soaking the parts in diesel, cleaning the tiny orifices with a fine wire, checking the spray pattern with a hand-priming pump he'd fabricated himself. He found 2 that were fouled beyond repair and had to drive 60 miles to a truck depot to find replacements. The parts man raised an eyebrow when Jed told him what they were for. Haven't seen one of those Wagners in 20 years, he'd said. Thought they'd all been melted down for scrap. Finally, it was time to see if the heart would beat. He installed 2 new heavy-duty truck batteries, their terminals gleaming with fresh dielectric grease. He bled the fuel lines up to the injectors, cracking the nuts one by one until a clean stream of diesel fuel dribbled out. He checked the oil, he checked the coolant. He took a deep breath, climbed into the cab, and stood on the heavy clutch pedal. He turned the key to the on position. The new oil pressure light glowed a defiant red. He pushed the starter button. The big starter motor engaged with a heavy clank, and the massive Cummins engine began to turn, slowly at first. Chug, chug, chug. It was the sound of immense weight being forced into motion. A plume of white smoke puffed from the rusty exhaust stack, then another. Jed kept his thumb on the button. Chug, chug, chug. Then a cough. One cylinder had fired, then another. Chug-a-bang. The whole frame shuddered. He gave it a touch of throttle, and the rhythm smoothed out. The slow, labored cranking gave way to a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the steel floorboards and up into Jed's bones. The red oil pressure light flickered and went out. A slow grin spread across Jed's face. The smoke from the stack turned from white to a hazy black, then cleared as the engine warmed up, settling into a low, throbbing idle that was as steady as a heartbeat. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. He spent the next month going through the rest of the machine. He drained and replaced the thick, honey-like gear oil in the differentials and planetaries. He rebuilt the hydraulic cylinders for the steering and the 3-point hitch, carefully replacing every O-ring and seal. He welded a crack he found in the articulation joint, grinding it smooth and reinforcing it with a thick steel plate. He replaced the shattered glass in the cab with new panes of safety glass, cut to fit. By the time the spring planting season arrived, the Wagner looked different. Jed had taken a wire wheel on an angle grinder to the worst of the rust and covered it with a coat of industrial green primer. It wasn't pretty, but it was protected. The cardboard obsolete sign was long gone, burned in his trash barrel. The engine now fired on the first touch of the starter, and the hydraulics were strong and responsive. The first day he took it to the field, it was like a local holiday. Trucks slowed on the county road to watch. Rich Peterson stopped his brand-new 4620 at the end of his own field, the one that bordered Jed's North 40, and just sat there, watching. Jed ignored them all. He backed the Wagner up to his old 6-bottom International plow, the one the 4020 could barely handle in 4th gear. The Wagner didn't even notice the weight. He dropped the plow into the black Iowa soil, throttled the Cummins up to a steady 1800 RPM, and let out the clutch. The tractor didn't flinch. The big, dual tires dug in, and the 6 plowshares sliced into the earth, turning over a deep, rich furrow of soil. The Cummins engine barely changed its tune, its deep baritone roar echoing across the valley. Jed could feel the power, a raw, unstoppable force flowing from the engine, through the transmission, and down into the very ground he was turning. He was plowing deeper and faster than he ever had with the 4020. By the end of the day, he had done more work than he used to do in 2. He was covered in dirt, his ears ringing from the engine's roar, but he was smiling. The talk at the co-op diner the next morning was all about Jed's monster. They weren't laughing anymore. There was a grudging respect in their voices. They'd seen the work it could do, but the skepticism remained. Sure, it runs now, one old-timer said over his coffee, but wait till something breaks. He won't find parts for that thing anywhere. Rich Peterson, sitting in his usual booth, just grunted. A fool and his money are soon parted. He got lucky. That engine won't last the season. The year 1973 rolled in on a wave of unprecedented prosperity for the American farmer. The Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly negotiated a massive purchase of American grain. The deal, which would later be called the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere. Corn, which had been trading at a little over $1 a bushel, suddenly shot past $3. Soybeans doubled. The effect in the heartland was like a gold rush. Suddenly, every farmer was rich, at least on paper. The banks, flush with cash and eager to capitalize on the boom, were practically giving money away. Loan officers who had once been tight-fisted gatekeepers were now traveling salesmen, visiting farms and encouraging their clients to leverage their assets and expand their operations. No one embraced this new reality more enthusiastically than Rich Peterson. The windfall from the '73 harvest was, to him, just a down payment. He used his new inflated land values as collateral to buy out two of his older neighbors, adding another 320 acres to his farm. He traded in his year-old 4620, taking a loss on it just to be the first farmer in the county to own the new king of the field. A John Deere 6030. It was a true beast, boasting over 175 horsepower, a comfortable sound-guard cab with a radio and air conditioning, and a price tag that made old-timers gasp. He bought a new, bigger planter and a massive 24-foot disc to go with it. His farm was a showcase of the latest and greatest technology, all of it gleaming, all of it financed. He was hailed as a visionary, a man with the courage to seize the moment. Jed Stone had a good year too. The high prices meant the corn from his 160 acres brought in more money than he had ever seen in his life. The temptation was there. The local banker called him twice, suggesting he could easily afford to buy the 80 acres for sale down the road. "Your land is your best asset, Jed," the banker had said smoothly. "Let's make it work for you." But Jed remembered his grandfather's words. "The land can't be taken from you if you own it outright," the old man had told him, his voice raspy from a lifetime of breathing farm dust. "But the bank, son, the bank can take the land and your soul along with it." So Jed resisted. Instead of buying more land, he improved what he had. He used his profits to pay cash for a better, newer 7-bottom Oliver plow, one perfectly matched to the Wagner's strength. He invested in soil testing and a targeted fertilizer program that boosted his yield significantly. He bought certified seed for the first time instead of using grain from his own bin. He put a new tin roof on the barn and poured a fresh concrete floor in the machine shed. Every improvement was paid for with cash from his pocket. He owed no one. To his neighbors, his discipline looked like fear. His caution was seen as a lack of ambition. At the diner, the conversation would turn to Rich Peterson's latest purchase, and then someone would shake their head and say, "Jed Stone's sitting on a gold mine and he's afraid to dig. He's farming like it's still 1950. One hot afternoon in late spring of 1974, the contrast between the two men was laid bare for anyone to see. They were working in their adjacent fields, separated only by a thin wire fence. Rich was in his 6030, cruising along at a brisk 7 miles an hour, pulling his 24-foot disc. The silver bubble of his sound-guard cab reflected the sun. Inside, Jed knew he was cool and comfortable, listening to the radio, the roar of his powerful engine reduced to a distant hum. Less than 100 yards away, Jed was on the open platform of the Wagner, wrestling with a new-to-him chisel plow, breaking up the hardpan on his North 40. The sun beat down on his neck. Dust and diesel fumes swirled around him. The roar of the Cummins was a constant, deafening presence. He had no radio, only the music of his machine, the deep thrum of the engine, the high-pitched whine of the hydraulics, and the groan of steel biting into compacted earth. He felt every vibration, smelled the hot oil, saw every cloud of dust his tires kicked up. While Rich was merely driving a machine, Jed felt like he was a part of his, their nervous systems intertwined. As the years ticked by, Rich's empire grew. He bought more land, bigger equipment. His debt grew with it, but in the booming farm economy of the mid-70s, debt was seen as a tool, not a danger. Jed continued on his own path, slowly improving his small farm, banking his profits, and maintaining his old iron. The Wagner tractor, once a laughingstock, was now a familiar, if eccentric sight in the county. It had never failed him. Its simple, robust design was easy to maintain, and the Cummins engine just kept running, its steady heartbeat a source of deep comfort to Jed. Then, in the late 70s, the winds began to shift. The word inflation started appearing on the news every night. The price of fuel and fertilizer began to climb steeply. To fight it, the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates. At first, it was just 1/4 of a point here, 1/2 a point there. At the co-op, farmers grumbled but didn't panic. "The price of corn will cover it," was the common refrain. One Saturday morning, Jed was at the bank depositing a check when he overheard the bank president talking to Rich Peterson. The prime lending rate, the rate offered to the most credit-worthy customers, had just jumped a full point to 12%. Rich just laughed it off. "You gotta spend money to make money, Tom," he boomed, slapping the banker on the back. "Rates go up, rates go down. It's the cost of doing business. The price of corn is never coming down again. We're feeding the world now." The banker forced a smile, but Jed saw a flicker of worry in his eyes. Jed finished his transaction and walked out into the sunshine, but a cold knot of unease was tightening in his gut. In his pocket, he could feel the crisp, folded deed to his farm. That piece of paper, the proof that he owned his 160 acres free and clear of any bank or creditor, suddenly felt like the heaviest, most valuable thing in the world. He looked up at the sky. The clouds on the horizon were getting darker, and he had a feeling a storm was coming, a storm that no amount of borrowed money could shelter a man from. The good years, the easy years, ended not with a bang, but with the quiet scratch of a pen in the Oval Office. In January of 1980, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The news crackled over the AM radios in tractor cabs and kitchens across the heartland. The very market that had fueled the boom, the endless demand from overseas, was shut off overnight. Corn prices, which had been holding steady, began a sickening slide. At the co-op diner, the confident talk of expansion and new equipment vanished, replaced by worried whispers. But Rich Peterson, ever the optimist, held court in his usual booth. "It's temporary," he declared, waving a dismissive hand. "A political stunt. They need our grain. The market will bounce back, you'll see. The smart money is staying in." That spring, however, the sky itself seemed to agree with the politicians in Washington. The rain stopped. April was dry. May was a dust bowl. The sun beat down with a relentless brassy glare, baking the rich black soil into a cracked grey pavement. Young corn shoots, which should have been knee-high by the end of the month, stood stunted and yellow, their leaves curled tight like tiny, desperate fists. Jed watched the sky and conserved his resources. The Wagner, with its immense torque and weight, allowed him to pull his chisel plow deeper than anyone else, breaking up the compacted subsoil to find what little moisture remained. He worked at night, when the air was cooler, to reduce evaporation, the tractor's single headlight cutting a lonely path through the darkness. The Cummins engine never faltered, its steady drone a comforting prayer against the silence of the drought. One sweltering afternoon in early June, Jed was replacing a worn-out bearing on his disc when he saw Rich's brand-new red pickup truck speeding down the gravel road, kicking up a plume of dust. It fishtailed to a stop next to Rich's field, and Rich jumped out, followed by a mechanic in greasy John Deere coveralls. Jed watched from his shed as they stood beside the silent, monolithic 6030, which sat idle in the middle of a half-planted field. Rich was gesturing wildly, his face red with anger and frustration. Jed knew what had happened. He'd heard the big Deere start up that morning, heard its high-pitched, turbocharged whine, and then heard it fall silent an hour later. The mechanic spent 2 hours with his head buried in the engine compartment, then another hour on a two-way radio in his service truck. Finally, he packed up his tools, had a short, heated conversation with Rich, and drove away. The 6030 didn't move. It sat there for the rest of the day, a monument to progress, paralyzed in a field of dust. 2 days later, Jed saw Rich out in the field with a smaller, older tractor, a 4430 he'd borrowed from a relative, trying to finish planting. The smaller tractor struggled with the big planter, its engine screaming in protest, its tires slipping in the dry soil. It was a slow, agonizing process. The story came out at the diner, as all stories did. The 6030 had suffered a catastrophic failure in its complex hydraulic pump, a specialized unit that powered everything from the steering to the rockshaft. A tiny metal filing, likely from the factory, had worked its way through the system, scoring the pump's finely machined internal components beyond repair. The part wasn't in stock in Des Moines, it wasn't even in stock at the regional depot in Moline. A new one had to be special ordered from Germany with a lead time of 3 weeks. 3 precious weeks in the heart of planting season lost. The repair bill, someone whispered, was going to be over $4,000. That same week, a hydraulic line on the Wagner sprung a pinhole leak while Jed was cultivating. It was a big, ugly hose that ran to one of the steering cylinders. He saw the telltale shimmer of oil on the frame, shut the engine down, and walked back to his shed. He had a roll of generic, high-pressure hydraulic hose and a set of reusable fittings he'd bought at a surplus auction years ago. With a hacksaw, 2 wrenches, and a bucket to catch the spilled fluid, he had a new hose built and installed in under an hour. He topped off the hydraulic reservoir from a 5-gallon pail he kept in the corner, and the Wagner roared back to life. The total cost of the repair was less than $30. As he drove back to the field, he passed the crippled 6030. It was already coated in a fine layer of dust, looking less like a machine and more like the gravestone of a failed idea. For the first time, Jed felt a sliver of pity for Rich Peterson. The man had bet everything on a future that was complicated, expensive, and, it turned out, incredibly fragile. The drought broke in late June with a series of violent thunderstorms, but it was too little, too late. The harvest that fall was a disaster across the county. Yields were down by a third, compounding the misery the grain embargo held, and prices stayed in the gutter. And then the real monster, the one that had been lurking in the shadows, showed its face. The Federal Reserve, in a desperate attempt to slay inflation, jacked up interest rates. The prime rate, which had seemed high at 12% just a few years earlier, rocketed past 15, then 18, then an unthinkable 21%. Variable rate operating loans, the lifeblood of modern farming, became a death sentence. The interest on Rich Peterson's massive debt was now compounding at a terrifying rate. The payments he had to make on his land and equipment more than doubled at the exact moment his income was cut in half. The confident swagger was gone. Jed saw him at the bank one Friday, his face pale and drawn, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't talking to the bank president anymore. He was sitting on a hard wooden bench outside the loan officer's closed door, waiting like a man about to hear a terrible diagnosis. The cracks in his empire were no longer visible only to a keen eye. They were gaping chasms, and the ground was crumbling under his feet. The winter of 1981 was bleak and quiet. The usual cheer of a completed harvest was absent. There was no talk of buying new equipment, no planning for next year. There was only a grim, pervasive fear. The weekly paper grew thick with legal notices, small print announcements of foreclosure auctions. Names that had been on mailboxes for generations were now listed under the cold, impersonal authority of the Boone County Sheriff. It was a slow-motion plague, and it seemed no one was immune. Rich Peterson held on through the winter, but everyone knew he was finished. He'd tried to sell some of his newer land to raise cash, but land values had collapsed. The same acres he had paid $3,000 for in the 70s were now barely worth $1,000, and no one was buying. His collateral was worthless. The bank, once his eager partner in expansion, was now an implacable enemy. They called his loans. The auction was set for a bitter cold Saturday in March, almost 10 years to the day since Jed had bought the Wagner. The sky was the color of lead, and a sharp wind cut across the barren fields, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees in Rich's yard. The crowd was different this time. They were quiet, somber. There was no laughter, no friendly joking. They were here as witnesses to a funeral, and they all knew the deceased could easily have been one of them. The auctioneer was the same man, Bill, but his gravelly voice had lost its jovial bark. It was flat, mechanical, as he moved from one piece of equipment to the next. Jed stood at the back of the crowd, his hands deep in the pockets of his worn canvas coat. He watched as Rich's life was sold off piece by piece. The massive 24-foot disc went for a fraction of its value. The state-of-the-art planter, with its liquid fertilizer tanks and electronic seed monitors, was bought by an out-of-state salvage dealer for scrap prices. The farmers of Boone County had no money for such things. Then they came to the 6030. It had been washed and waxed, its green paint gleaming even under the flat grey sky. It looked powerful and proud, a king dethroned. "All right, folks," Bill the auctioneer said, his voice weary. "Here she is, a John Deere 6030. Good rubber, runs great. What am I bid for this fine machine?" Silence. The only sound was the wind. It was the silence of fear, of empty pockets and broken dreams. No one could afford the payments, the fuel, or the potential repair bills on such a complex tractor. Come on now, start me at 20,000, Bill pleaded. That's a steal. More silence. Jed could see Rich standing by the porch of his house his grandfather had built. His wife beside him, her arm wrapped tightly around his. He wasn't the arrogant, boastful man Jed had known. He was a ghost, hollowed out by failure. 15,000, the auctioneer begged. Give me 15. A low bid came from a dealer in the front. 10. The word hung in the cold air like an insult. $10,000 for a machine that had cost Rich nearly 5 times that. Bill tried to work the bid up, but there was no interest. Going once at 10,000, he said, his voice full of resignation. Going twice. Jed thought of that day, 10 years ago. He thought of the laughter, the scorn. He thought of Rich's condescending grin. A hot surge of triumph could have filled him, a desire to see his rival utterly humiliated. But looking at the broken man by the porch, all Jed felt was a profound and aching sadness. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. This was a man who loved the land, who had worked hard, who had simply believed the experts and the bankers and the promise of a future that never came. Going 3 times, the auctioneer's voice trailed off. 11,000, a quiet, firm voice said from the back. Every head turned, just as they had a decade before. Jedediah Stone stepped forward, his gaze not on the auctioneer but on Rich Peterson. A murmur went through the crowd. The dealer who had bid 10,000 just shrugged and shook his head, unwilling to go higher. Sold. Bill's hammer cracked down, the sound sharp and final in the cold air. For $11,000 to Jedediah Stone. While his neighbors were going under, Jed had survived. The drought had hurt his yields, and the low prices had squeezed his profits to almost nothing, but he had endured. His secret was simple: no debt. The checks he wrote were for fuel, for seed, for the occasional part for his aging but reliable equipment. There were no envelopes from the bank, no loan payment stubs to be paid. He and his wife had tightened their belts, eating from their large garden, patching old clothes instead of buying new ones. The Wagner tractor was the heart of his survival. It sipped diesel compared to the big new tractors. When a water pump bearing started to whine, he didn't call a dealer. He pressed a new one in himself, using his grandfather's 20-ton shop press. The cost was $12. He farmed the way his grandfather had, relying on his own 2 hands, his own ingenuity, and the simple, honest logic of well-maintained iron. While the modern world of farming collapsed around him, his small, self-sufficient island remained solvent. Jed paid for the 60/30 with a cashier's check. He didn't need the tractor. The Wagner was all the power he required for his 160 acres. As the crowd dispersed, their pickup trucks rolling slowly out of the long driveway, Jed walked over to where Rich was still standing, staring blankly at the ground. Rich didn't look up. "Come to Gloatstone?" he asked, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Come to tell me you told me so?" "No, Rich," Jed said quietly. "I didn't." He held out a set of keys, not the keys to the 60/30, it was a different set, worn and simple. "These are for the Wagner," Jed said. "The bank is taking your land tomorrow, but they're not taking your hands, and they're not taking your knowledge of this soil." Rich finally looked up, his eyes filled with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about my North 40, Jed said. "It's the hardest ground I've got. I can't seem to get it to produce right. I need someone to farm it for me next year. On shares, 50/50. You'll need a tractor." Rich stared at the keys, then at Jed's face, searching for the punchline, for the trick. He found only sincerity. "Why?" he whispered. "After everything, why would you do this?" "Because this county has lost enough good farmers," Jed said, pressing the keys into Rich's limp hand. "And because my grandfather always said a man isn't measured by how high he climbs, but by how he helps his neighbor when they fall." He turned and walked toward the 60/30. He climbed into the silent, comfortable cab. It smelled of vinyl and air freshener, a world away from the honest diesel and grease smell of his Wagner. He started the engine, its turbocharged whine smooth and powerful. He would take it home, park it in his shed, and keep it maintained. Maybe one day Rich would be in a position to buy it back. Maybe not. It didn't matter. It was no longer a symbol of hubris or failure. It was just a machine. The news of what Jed had done spread faster than fire in a dry field. At the diner, the talk changed. The head shaking and whispers about stubborn old Jed were replaced by a quiet, profound respect. The men who had laughed at his pile of junk now saw the wisdom in it. They saw a man who had weathered the worst economic storm in 50 years, not through luck, but through principle. Jed Stone, the man who farmed like it was 1950, had become the model for how to survive in the 1980s. Younger farmers, struggling with their own debts, started stopping by his shed, not to talk about the markets, but to ask how to rebuild a carburetor or how to set the timing on an old diesel. Jed always had time, always had a cup of coffee ready, and always shared what he knew freely. Rich took the offer. The first day he drove the Wagner, he hated it. It was loud, crude, and uncomfortable. But as the weeks went by, he began to understand the machine. He felt the direct connection to the soil through the steel frame. He learned the particular rhythm of the big Cummins, how to shift the heavy transmission by feel, how to listen for the slightest change in the engine's note that signaled a change in the soil density. He was no longer a pilot in a climate-controlled cockpit. He was a farmer again, connected to his work in a way he hadn't been for years. He and Jed worked the two farms together, sharing labor and equipment. The North 40, under Rich's skilled management and Jed's deep tilling machine, produced the best crop it ever had. Years passed. The farm economy slowly, painfully recovered. Rich eventually got back on his feet. He never bought back the 60/30. Instead, he bought the 80 acres next to Jed's home place, paying for it with a modest, sensible loan he paid off in 7 years. He farmed it with a pair of clean, well-maintained John Deere 4020s, the same model Jed still used for lighter work. The two men, once rivals, were now the closest of friends, their bond forged in the fires of the crisis. One warm autumn afternoon, years later, Jed stood in his machine shed with his grandson, a boy of 12 with curious eyes and hands already eager to hold a wrench. The Wagner was in the center of the floor, its primer green paint faded and scarred from thousands of hours of hard work. Jed was giving it a fresh coat, not of shiny enamel, but of the same tough industrial primer. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why don't you get a new tractor? Like Mr. Peterson's. One with a radio and air conditioning." Jed stopped painting and looked at the boy. He dipped his brush back in the can and made a long, steady stroke along the tractor's massive frame. "This tractor," Jed said, his voice soft, "taught me the most important lesson there is. The world will always try to sell you something new, something faster, something that promises to make your life easier. It'll tell you that what you have is old, that it's obsolete." He pointed with his brush at the spot on the grill where the cardboard sign had once been taped. "But there's a difference between what something costs and what it's worth. This old iron doesn't have a computer. It doesn't have a radio. But it has something more important. It has honesty. It doesn't hide its nature. Every bolt, every lever, every gear is right here where you can see it and touch it and fix it with your own two hands. It doesn't owe any man or any bank a single dime. It belongs to us, and because of that, this land belongs to us." He handed the brush to his grandson. "Never be afraid of what the world calls obsolete," he said. "Sometimes it's just another word for wisdom, for freedom." The boy took the brush and carefully painted a stroke next to his grandfather's. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the fields of stubble. The old Wagner stood in the dimming light of the shed, not as a relic of the past, but as a promise for the future. Its simple, powerful heart ready for the next season and the next generation.